Hello, my name is Jeffrey Nicholas. I'm a professor of philosophy at Providence College. This is a lecture on Eclipse of Reason, Chapter 1. This is part 2 of the lecture. In the first part of the lecture, which I invite you to watch, we discuss the nature of objective reason and how it dissolved over the centuries in Western society. And we recalled that Horkheimer believes that subjective rationality, the change that has been brought about in reason in the West, leaves human beings without the capacity to access an objective world by which they might critique it. In this second part, we're going to look more into the nature of subjective rationality and its relation to self-preservation and pragmatism, and then we will conclude. So subjective rationality is defined as a faculty of classification, inference, and deduction, no matter what the specific content, the abstract functioning of the thinking mechanism. So here it's just our ability, our capacity to classify things. That is a tree, that is a car, that is living, that is dead, that is tall, that is short. Right? Or to infer things. I see a bunch of people running down the street. Maybe someone is chasing them, or maybe they are part of a running group. Or deduction, right? And of course, you're familiar with all kinds of deductions from Sherlock Holmes. So it doesn't matter what the content of the issue is, right? We could classify human beings, we can classify living things, we can classify non-living things, we can infer, we can deduce, regardless of the content. So we're just talking about the abstract functioning of the thinking mechanisms. Primarily, subjective rationality is concerned with the means to the ends, right? So how do we get from A to B in the quickest manner? And purposes are taken for granted. So it doesn't matter what B is. It doesn't matter what B refers to. We're only worried about the means to get to B. And we want to keep that in mind as we go forward, because this is the singular distinction from objective reason. Objective reason refers to an objective order in reality that we always refer to in our reasoning. Subjective rationality, in contrast, does not have any content. There's no order, objective order to refer to. As we've defined it then, subjective rationality has two sides, the instrumental and the formal. So the instrumental is what we're most used to thinking about. What is the most efficient means to a pre-given end? So if I want to stay healthy, what is the most efficient means there? It might be cutting back on the food, or it might be taking drugs, or whatever it is that is. We're looking for the most efficient means, and we don't question what the end that we're given is. Now that makes sense in something like health, but there are other ends which we might talk about. So if we wanted to stop people from having certain activities allowed to them, the most efficient means might be just to kill them, right? Or it might be to pass laws that are detrimental to freedom. Okay. The formal aspect is the faculty of coordinating and classification. This is most associated with the science, right? So we classify and coordinate things, and it doesn't matter what our approach is. We can classify them and coordinate them however we want. All we're doing here is trying to organize our world, because the world doesn't have an organization to it, right? There is no objective world order that we can refer to that gives us that. So for Horkheimer, where objective reason requires non-conformity to reality, subjective rationality requires conformity to reality, right? So we accept the world as it is because all we're interested in is achieving the goals that are given to us beforehand, right? So you might think about recent movies like The Matrix, in which characters are thrown into a world and they just conform to it as best they can. So there's a scene where Mouse is having a steak dinner with one of the one of the guys after Neo, and Mouse says, "I don't believe that. I know that the steak isn't here, but it tastes good." So he conforms to reality as it is because it satisfies the ends pre-given to him. One of the primary ends given to us is self-preservation. Right. So Horkheimer says that the only ends that are worthy of having under subjective rationality is that which preserves the subject self. Now, this doesn't mean necessarily preserving my life. It might just be preserving my comfort or preserving the world as the way I see it, right? So I try to resist change. I might do things that may be unhealthy for me because it's more comfortable, say, to sit on the couch than it is to get up and go for a run. Okay. But self-preservation becomes primary in this discussion. And part of the issue here is that we cannot evaluate the ends that are there, right? We can only satisfy those ends. So no object is valuable or reasonable in itself, right? We don't think about such things anymore because they are only valuable insofar as we give them value. Again, this is a stark contrast to objective reason, which refers to an objective order in the world. As proof of that, Horkheimer talks about how values are reified. Now, he was not exposed to these ads that we have up here, but he was certainly exposed to advertising, and we can look at advertisings to see how values are reified. So to say something is reified is to say that it's something outside of us and becomes a thing itself, and it's no longer something that belongs to us. So when we think about happiness, for instance, we think about what happiness is, and it becomes reified in the context of something outside of us. You can't buy happiness, but you can buy tea, and that's kind of the same thing. And if you've ever had a Lipton tea, well, you can judge whether that brings you happiness or not. Or Dunkin' Donuts, the truth is out. Dunkin' beats Starbucks.com. Again, the truth is associated with a product, so it becomes reified, something outside of us that we can buy or sell and purchase. So this all goes back again to this issue of self-preservation, right? What are we trying to preserve? We're trying to preserve our way of life, which may be drinking Lipton tea or making money for Dunkin' Donuts or whatever it is. And all that we're really concerned with is classifying things and trying to achieve that self-preservation. Associated with this, then, according to Horkheimer, is the philosophy of pragmatism. In pragmatism, truth is measured not by objective reality, but by success in achieving aims. Now, it's certainly true that pragmatists may not all agree with this position, but this is one way of thinking about what pragmatism is, and it certainly fits what Horkheimer is trying to argue against here, right? That pragmatism is about following subjective rationality to get what I want. So if it's pragmatic to fire someone because they won't accept my advances, well, then that's all that I need to do, and truth isn't really something that we can refer to. Again, here we can contrast this with objective reason, and we can contrast it with the saying of Martin Luther King Jr. that we looked at in the first lecture, that law has to abide by the moral or eternal law. And certainly with pragmatism, that isn't true. There's not an objective reality by which we have to measure our truth. It is only the truth that we create ourselves, and that truth lies in achieving our aims, part of which is self-preservation. In this case, then, truth becomes the majority rule. Now, when Horkheimer talks about majority rule here, he doesn't necessarily mean the most people. He means the people with the most power. And what he's trying to point out is that under pragmatism and under subjective rationality, which is dominant in our world, democracy becomes not something that reveals what people want, but becomes a source of power for the interest of various people. Now, I mentioned in the last lecture that Horkheimer was an emigre from the Weimar Republic and from Hitler because he was trying to escape Hitler's brutal rule. But we have to remember that the Weimar Republic was a democracy, right? And that Hitler came to power through voting. Okay, 38% of the German people voted for Hitler in various elections that led to him taking power in the Weimar Republic and leading to the Third Reich. We might look at the way that power is distributed in the United States as well. We know here that various presidents have become president not because they received the majority vote. And again, Horkheimer may not necessarily agree with majority vote in that sense, but because they had the power of a majority voice. And we see that with the Electoral College. The interest of the people also can lead to other forms of subjective rationality and self-preservation. So we can talk about the Patriot Act, which does a tremendous job of limiting or scaling back the freedoms that Americans enjoyed, all in the name of security. And we can talk about gun laws versus people dying and other such things. Where does the majority rule lie? Where does the interest of the people lie? And why does democracy tend to function in such a way that it actually excludes the will of the people rather than supporting the will of the people? So for Horkheimer, we began with this question about why we might need access to an objective world. And he presents us this thesis about objective reason, which allows us to be obstinate to reality and to question authority. And he specifically mentions Socrates, and I brought in Martin Luther King Jr., certainly two people who referred to an objective truth in order to question the world in which they live. And Horkheimer believes that our world has been taken over by pragmatism and this subjective rationality so that we can no longer question reality. We can merely accept it as it is and try to find the best way to preserve our own aims and issues that are given to us beforehand, right? We don't question these things. These are just given to us because values are reified in this world. So it certainly raises questions about some of the other quotes and issues that we talked about when we looked at Stephen Hawking, who said that philosophy is dead. Philosophers have not kept up with modern developments in science, particularly physics, right? He's arguing that what's important is not this objective world, but this science of classification and getting things done, particularly with physics, right? And we see evolutionary biologists arguing the same thing. And we started with quotes about the way that science needs to be unfettered. Now, Horkheimer certainly is not arguing that we shouldn't be scientific. What he is saying is that science should be subjected to, or at least coincide with, some kind of objective reason. And we will explore this theory as we cover the rest of Eclipse of Reason in the following lectures, which I invite you to do. Thank you.